in here where like I'll play a video of myself and people like the video of me more than they like me being in person and giving a live talk. So like they'll rather listen to me. And if I'm on video, then somehow like I can turn the volume up a little more, or I can pause it, or I can go back and listen to a bit, or I can actually look at the timer and see how much of this is left. Like, when's he going to be done? And I know it's counting down to the end. Or you could hit like 1.5 or times 2, you know, treat me like a Marco Polo Plus membership and speed things up a little bit. So hopefully what we do here is a valuable conclusion to our semester. I've got everything that I want to say right here on this Post-it note. So everything that needs to be said can fit on this. It'll take a little longer than just reading off the notes and prompts that I have on the post. I always wanted to be that professor who could like fit a whole talk onto a Post-it note or have no Post-it note. So we're moving in that direction. I want to do a summary and recap and review of our course together, Philosophy 311. Philosophy in culture, or is it philosophy and culture? Philosophy in culture, I think, is what it is. And that entails kind of 3 movements, I think, that we've done. We kind of did the beginning movement, which is Peter Kreeft and the Journey, if you remember all the way back to the Journey paper. And then we did kind of a history of Western philosophical thought and ideas, kind of getting us into the modern period / postmodern period. And then we did the 3rd phase of the class, which is really more of the worldview and looking at alternative perspectives to Christianity that emerge in the 20th century. They've been around longer than that, but for us and kind of as menu options, they become more like real live options in the 20th century. So, and 21st century for all of you, because who cares about the 20th century anymore? It's good for like fashion and like retro shows and throwbacks. It's not really good in and of itself. Like we'd rather forget about the 20th century for the most part. But you're thankful that the internet happened, I think. So I'm calling this like a history of philosophy and values and ideas, but the subtitle might be more exciting, which is like surviving COVID-19 using nothing but the history of Western philosophical thought and Western values and morality. How do you survive COVID-19? This is like a survival kit. Like you go into your back pocket and you've got like whatever you've got in your pocket when you crash or when your ship gets wrecked and you're on the desert island. What do you have left? And so let's say you had to survive COVID-19 and all you had was what we've talked about in this class to get you started. Like you don't have anything to build a fire. You don't have clean water. You don't have shelter. You got to worry about those things. But how do you survive the times that we live in? And really, for many of us, it becomes a real case of survival. You're wondering if you're going to survive, or you're wondering if your way of life is going to survive, or you're wondering if the values that you have are going to survive. I remember a year ago when we all went online and we were thinking about like just finishing the semester, and then what was the summer going to be like, and were we even going to have students in the fall? And I can remember seriously worrying that I wasn't going to have a job in higher education because none of you would come back and higher education would completely go belly up and there would be no higher education by the time we got back. Anybody like think that? Like, was that a concern for anyone? No, just me? Okay. Well, that was good worst case scenario planning on my part. So like prompted me to do a whole bunch of like creative work and writing. And so that was really, it was good for me to have a little bit of fear, kind of light the fire under me a little bit. But I don't know why this is like pinned right here. Unpinned. Does it show that I'm being pinned right now in my video? That'd be weird. How are you going to survive it? Like, have you thought about mental health and whether or not you are, because some people are like in serious mental health crisis as a result of this. Some people in serious physical health crisis. They might not physically survive. And I suppose I'm not worried so much about college age demographics surviving physically as I am, are you going to survive it intellectually? Are you going to survive it emotionally? Are you going to survive it spiritually? And that's really where I think the history of philosophy and the ideas and the values that we've discussed in the class can actually help, because the greater threat to your wellness and to your well-being from COVID-19 is the long-term psychological, mental, spiritual damage. So for example, people who haven't been to church in a year, and they've been doing online church, they've been doing virtual church, but knowing people who haven't left their house in a year is something we have to talk about, whether that is something to be survived, how do we get through to the other side of that. So I'm going to recap the class, but the goal of recapping the class is to get to, is there anything that we can take away here that's of practical survival value? Remember, we talked about the way that philosophy enhances life, it enriches your life, it makes life better, it helps you ask good critical questions, it helps you negotiate your own life and make decisions in a better kind of way. But what happens when that whole framework for life and decision making that gets fragmented so much to the point where it's not a resource to you anymore, right? It just seems very far away, it seems very intellectual, it seems very heady, not relevant directly to life. So that's where we're going to pick up. And we can start with the journey. And if I could just use my space here. In Peter Kreesch's The Journey, we talked about moving from the cave. And if I could just kind of narratively frame this really fast, we move from the cave to the cross. And it's a movement out of darkness into light. It's a movement from slavery to a certain extent, slavery to ignorance. It's a movement to rebirth. It's a movement to enlightenment. And there are these key stages along the way. And you all wrote about this in your papers, and everybody picked up on different ones. But you have to pass through these different points along the journey, one of which is cynicism and Epicureanism, right? Those aren't the same thing. I'm putting a little slash there because I think that they go together. So on the one hand, you could be just an Epicurean and you could say, I'm going to seek pleasure, regardless of whether there's COVID-19 or not, I'm just going to seek pleasure from this life. I'm going to do whatever it takes to feel good in whatever position I am. And this is not to pick on anyone who's in the virtual meeting, or you felt like you weren't safe to come to campus, or your roommate was diagnosed with COVID, or you had exposure to exposure, or whatever that looks like. We all have a certain threshold of risk that we're comfortable with. And we all have a certain threshold of pleasure that we want to seek in this life. Some of us don't mind being a little cold. Some of us can't stand it when we're a little cold. It's very distracting. Some of us don't like being too warm. Got to open the window, got to take something off. You got to get comfortable. So in one sense, pursuit of comfort is part of what it means to be human. But if that's the only goal, is to pursue comfortability, right? I chose my very Epicurean, professional dress attire to wear today. It's more comfortable for me to teach in casual clothes than it is for me to teach dressed up in a suit and tie. So recognizing that we have a desire to pursue a certain level of comfort and pleasure, I think, is important. But if we stop there on the journey, if that's the only thing that we seek, we're going to miss a lot of the good things of life that come with a certain amount of discomfort, right? You could also be cynical about the world and say that there's no point searching out the meaning of life. I don't think that's any of you guys here, because you come to Grace Christian University and you want to pursue the good. It's something that you want to do, is grow in your faith, in your knowledge, in your understanding, in your practical professional disciplines. You see the value of the pursuit. So I would not say that you're cynics, all right? But we also come to other stages of the journey. And let's go like nihilism and relativism. All right, so this is a stage on the journey, and I'm doing the slash again. Remember, nihilism is still down in the ground, and it's really thoroughly unpacked by James Sire. We did that at the end of the course as an alternative worldview, and it's interesting how often this comes up, this idea that there is no value, that nothing matters, that there's why pursue anything at all, right? And again, I don't think that this is all of you, but I think that I want to asterisk the nihilism that's out there, just recognizing that there's kind of this ghostly force that's out there. I would call it a spiritual power. If we were to talk about the Apostle Paul's principalities and powers in heavenly places, nihilism might be like, you guys seen the Never-Ending Story? Familiar with that movie? Nihilism is like the nothing. It's not a thing, but it's out there and it wants to steal and kill and destroy, kind of like the devil. So there's this nihilism, this threat that's out there. And it's like a spiritual threat. And it's always kind of on the fringes. It's sort of like that feeling like with the Chauvin verdict last night around 5 o'clock. You're like, oh gosh, what is going to happen? Like, is it going to be a guilty verdict? Or is it going to be like a not guilty verdict or a not guilty enough verdict where the country is going to tear itself apart? Do you have that feeling? That's kind of like that threat of nihilism. Like there's a real threat, there's a real danger that's out there, but I don't know when it's actually going to happen. And so you get the guilty verdict and you're like, okay, at least we're okay for another news cycle. At least we're okay for 24 hours, right? But it's that constant threat of destruction. And that's like a psychological state that we live in now. Like, I don't know what's going to be the next thing that's going to attack me and threaten to destroy me. Like, I don't know if what I'm doing matters. Like, why come to class? Is it going to matter? Like, why get married? Is it going to matter? Why pursue a career? Why buy a house? Like, all this is under this constant state of threat. Will it matter? Is it all going to get torn down? And that's kind of like the psychological state of nihilism that we live in. But we also live in this relativism, which is a profound moral relativism that says, you know, if it's okay for you, then it's okay for you. It's okay for me. It's okay for me. Whatever we do is fine as long as we agree not to hurt each other. We won't be mean. We'll be nice. And as long as you work hard and you're kind, then that's good enough, right? And everything else can be relative. Well, there's a sense that there's more. Even if you buy into that relativism, remember, relativism is two people agreeing to say, okay, this is relative between us. We disagree about it, but we're going to say it's not worth arguing about. And maybe there's something more to it than that, but we're agreeing to disagree there. All right, so then you come to theism versus deism versus pantheism. And if I could put in deism / moralistic therapeutic deism as Christian Smith's description of the most common religious view amongst American, it was teenagers like 10 years ago. It's more like all millennials now. But basically God exists and he's there to help me when I need help, and he's going to give me the good things that I want, and he's going to reward me, and he's going to punish the bad people. And we basically believe in a God who's out there, but is not really involved in our lives unless we need to call on that God for the stuff we want. I think that in our culture, there is a real combination of these views. In other words, it's possible in our culture to hold both views at the same time, to be a moralistic therapeutic deist, that God's out there and not involved, and also believe that we are sparks of the divine and that divine energy flows through us, and that God is in everything and everywhere, maybe especially in nature or especially in really good Instagram-worthy photos. And God is there and present in our experience, but not really in our everyday life and decision-making. That follows. It kind of is a contradiction of itself, but God is present. Except when I choose to do my own thing, I don't need God. But if I choose to look inside myself for God, God is there. But I don't always want to do that, right? So there's this tension in our culture. And again, I'm not talking about you all in making your journey. I'm just saying that out there in the world, all of these things are. In our culture today, you could go and meet and talk to anyone. I could talk to people in my gym downtown who adopt all of these views in various combinations with each other. And they would say, yes, that probably pretty well describes me. Right. So then we have to get through, and we get to kind of in Peter Kreeft's The Journey, right, we get to the Bible and we get to the story of Israel in the Bible, right? There's your Bible bookmark. That's how you know it's Bible. Not just any book. It's got a little marker. There you go. So we get to the story of the Bible and we read about God's activity in Israel in the Old Testament, saving Israel, delivering Israel, giving them the law, starting off a story in which God interacts with humans. So this is a different kind of worldview. And beyond a basic theism, God is a moral lawgiver, we finally get to like a biblical theism, if I could say that. And the question is, I think the question for you and for me is whether the biblical theism that you learn about in all of the other classes, right? We try to do a little bit of that in here, but you get this from like Old Testament class, New Testament class. You get it from Bible classes and theology classes. What the Bible has to teach, does that have any survival value in COVID-19? Does that have any survival value in the 21st century? Because people find survival value in pleasure. Like, even if it means opioid addiction. Like, you take drugs because the drugs make you feel better. I'll say that again, make sure you get that. People listening at home. You take drugs because the drugs make you feel better. If they didn't make you feel better, you wouldn't take the drugs. Right? So drugs work. But the question is whether they work in the best kind of way. Do they lead to the best possible way to live? Or as Mumford and Son sang in the first song that we used at the beginning, do they lead to life as it's meant to be? Is there such a thing as life as it's meant to be? Or is it just the pursuit of pleasure, you make it up as you go along? Or is it all just meaningless? And as long as we agree not to hurt each other, that's good enough. That's the basic lowest common denominator thinking. Or maybe we're sparks of the divine, or maybe God is out there and we can appeal to God. So I think that there's these movements of the culture that are trying to find survival value in whatever we're doing, whether that's in the laws that we make, the politics that we do as a society, whether that's how you raise your kids and how you go to school. In a place like Texas, it would have to do with how, when do you start your kids in football? Do you start them when they're 5 or when they're 6? I don't know, right? People would have knockdown, drag out arguments about how early you should start your kids in Texas football if you live in Texas, okay? My point is that the culture is looking for survival value in whatever kinds of worldviews that we adopt. Does Christianity, does biblical theism offer a better kind of survival value? Does it offer more survival value? And I'm trying to suggest that it does, but I feel like that is an uphill climb to try to prove that. Right? Or maybe we think it ought to, but we're not convinced. And so we'll believe things intellectually, like all the doctrines of the faith, but how we live looks more like these other options. That's kind of what I'm getting at. I'll pause for any questions though, just kind of wrapping up Peter Kreeft and the journey. Anybody in the meet have a question that could be recorded for all time, for posterity? No? Okay. Raise your hand and it'll give me a little bloop if you have a thought that you want to share. Otherwise, I'll just keep cracking on, as they say in the Great British Baking Show. Okay, well, let's talk about the history of these ideas. In the beginning, I talked to you about a kind of a timeline. And we talked about the Greek philosophical tradition, and we talked about the Hebrew wisdom tradition. And if you remember, this kind of develops over several centuries with Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, not in that order. As Fazzini says, morons, right? They're nothing compared to the great Fazzini. But here we go through the centuries and we make our way to a Greco-Roman world that is seeded and fertile ground for Christianity to take root. We talked about that. Christianity as an outgrowth of Judaism with Jesus as the Messiah of Israel, and then the Gentile mission to all the nations, allows a church to take root in this Greco-Roman world that is well prepared to ask questions around the existence of God. What is the good life? What does virtue look like? What is a human? What is a human for? Is there any meaning to life, any meaning to history? So all of Sire's worldview questions maybe weren't fully asked by Plato, Aristotle, Socrates. They were starting to broach upon those topics. But Christianity, by bringing in this Hebrew wisdom tradition, brings in the notion of a creator God, a personal God, because we're working out of this biblical story. We get the notion of a person, a human being created in the image of God. We get personal covenant relationship with that God. We get sin and what's wrong with the story. We get redemption pieces. We get what is the meaning of history. So all of those worldview questions, the Christian tradition can import and download from the Hebrew wisdom tradition, even as it takes root in Greek philosophy. And so you have Augustine, who synthesizes these two traditions together. He merges the Greek philosophical tradition, he baptizes it, he makes it Christian, he tries to get rid of as much pagan elements as he can. You can argue about whether he did a good job of that or not. And we'll just stick Augustine, it's not totally accurate, but we'll put him at 500, just because Augustine's influence lasts from 400 to 500. And we're being super rough and ready here, but we're just going to put Thomas Aquinas at 1200. Augustine redoes Plato for that Christian tradition. Aquinas redoes Aristotle for the Christian tradition. So by the time you get to 1200, really this whole philosophical tradition has been brought in and merged with Christianity. And so this is where we get the notion of the Western tradition. And it's worth noting that although Augustine was African and North African, primarily this is a European tradition. It's primarily educated, like wealthy, elite, male, predominantly male figures who are doing this Western tradition philosophical work. We're not really thinking about the Greek East. We're not really thinking about Christianity in Africa. We're not really thinking at this point about Islam, although Islam is happening. We're not really thinking about Eastern religion. In the course of philosophy and culture, the primary cultural background is this Western tradition. And that's why we inherit the types of values and even some of the ways of asking the questions that we have today. A little thing happens in here in 1500 called the Reformation. And if we could come in with some different eras, I could probably say we could call this the classical era. And we could call Thomas Aquinas in his day the medieval era. But starting with 1500, religiously you get the Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther, John Calvin. And philosophically you get the beginning of modern philosophy, especially with René Descartes. So I'll go ahead and start the modern period here around 1500. And I like to include Luther as a modern, and I like to include Descartes, René Descartes. There's lots of others, but let's just throw Immanuel Kant in there, because I can't help but do it. And we'll call this Enlightenment. Enlightenment. Do you ever have this experience where you want to have a really nice, concise board drawing, but then your words get too long? We'll make it work. Okay, so we have this enlightenment. So this period that starts, and we could characterize that by the search for autonomous reason. We could focus on rationality and knowing things. Certainly Luther had a lot of doctrines that he believed, but also the isolation of the individual, right? Descartes, I think, therefore I am. Or Luther, I take my stand here in my conscience and plain reason, God help me. He takes his stand against the Roman Catholic Church. And then enlightenment, right, basically just says, think for yourself. That's what Descartes did. He said, I think, therefore I am. That's what Luther did. Say, God help me, I'm thinking for myself. Sorry, Roman Catholic Church, I interpret the Bible different than you. He's thinking for himself. And that's the primary way of thinking about modernity. I think that'll help you sum it up in a nutshell. Okay, so we have this Western tradition that has become baptized in Christian. By the time we get to the Enlightenment, we're going to have more and more secular thinking. We could call it a secularization. We could call it the isolation of the self. This is where the self becomes just another component in the society, becomes another cog in the wheel. Back here, leading up to Martin Luther's day, the self was really important. Like, you were a big deal. Like, you had this relationship with God. Even if you didn't understand it that much, you knew that the world was magical. You knew that the world was mystical. You knew that God was doing something and that miracles were real and salvation was real and the devil was real, and you could believe in all of that. By the time we get to Kant in 1700, and he says, think for yourself, you don't need all that anymore. You've got scientific explanations for everything. You've got increased atheism. You've got people who don't need God to get on with their lives. They're very content just to live life as it is right in front of them without any higher explanations. And so even morality becomes a matter of duty. What is my duty? What's the least possible thing that I could do and still get credit for it morally? Right? Some of you might be thinking, like, how many absences do I have in this class? I hope Dr. Leverin isn't keeping track of absences anymore. And you're right, I gave up. Like, I gave up keeping track of absences. People are so absent and like move in and out, online, virtual. I would have to have like a 4-page, a 4-tab spreadsheet to keep track of every class and the different ways people could be absent, different reasons and different times for this class, for every class. So 4 different spreadsheet for a different class, 4 different spreadsheets just to keep track of attendance, right? And so you might be asking yourself, frame your attendance in terms of, okay, what's the minimum I have to be here in order to pass this class, right? Just note that when you're thinking that way, you're framing your life in terms of a duty for which there's a minimum standard. And if I could just do that minimum standard, I'll get enough to get credit, I'll get enough to get by. What this sense of duty-based morality breeds is pragmatism. And that's a pragmatic theory of truth. We didn't talk about this a lot in the lecture time, but basically pragmatism says whatever works. So I'm going to think for myself in the Enlightenment. I'm going to make my own decisions, and I'm going to do whatever works for me to make it through my life. Right? Well, if I'm going to be absent, like, that works. I can pipe into the meeting. Like, I can come to the virtual meeting. That works. I meet the minimum standard. It's working for me. I don't have to shower. Maybe you did. I don't have to get dressed. Dr. Leverin barely did. I just threw on the sweatshirt today. I'm going to do whatever that minimum standard is. So I'm not exempt from this either. Like, I had to wear something, but I wore the most comfortable, practical thing because I too am a pragmatist. I'm not exempting myself. I'm not saying you guys are wrong and I'm the one who's right. I'm saying that as a society, we're secularized. Ourselves are isolated from one another. We do what is our duty. We do the minimum oftentimes of what we can do, and we'll do whatever works. Right? If it doesn't work for you, you're not going to do it. doesn't bring you some kind of pleasure, all right, you're probably not going to do it. Questions so far? Doing good? So that's the modern period that we've inherited, and also has to do with industrialization and technology and scientific method. Okay, but now, if we could jump to 1900, and we were to enter what we've talked about as the postmodern period. And it's really disingenuous to call this like a period of time, because what postmodernity really wants to do is just say everything that's between the lines and say everything that's gone unsaid for the last 500 years. So when we talk about postmodernity, we're going to talk about the fragmentation of all of this, or the radicalization of all of this modernity stuff. So postmodernity takes modernity and says, let's make it radical. And it's not like radical, like you'd say radical in the 1980s, or totally awesome. Like I can remember the shirts that would just say radical. You're like, come on, that's the best, like totally awesome. I can remember a shirt, I said to my mom, I was probably 8 years old, and it was like a rainbow color or metallic or something, some kind of print t-shirt that said like totally awesome. Like, why would I want this shirt? But I can remember saying to my mom, like, I would like to get one of those totally awesome shirts. And she said, because she was very influenced by Christianity, like we were going to church and stuff, she said, well, you know, the only one who's totally awesome is God. And so you wouldn't want to wear a shirt that said totally awesome, because only God is worthy of that totally awesome status. You got me. It's still a cool shirt. It wasn't a cool shirt, but at the time I did think it was. So postmodernism is a radicalization of all of this. So if this means think for yourself, it would be a radical version of think for yourself. If modernity starts to secularize, postmodernism would be a radical secularization. If modernity started to isolate the self, and you think of yourself as an independent unit or an independent thinker, then that becomes even more radical and isolated. Think of the way that you interact with social media, right? Or as Rick Roderick was talking about last week, like, could you turn the computer off? Like, could you flip it off? Not like flip it off, like flip it the bird, but like, could you turn the computer off? Could you turn Instagram off and walk away? Could you turn Facebook off and walk away? Like most people, I watched The Social Dilemma. This is probably back in January or December, I can't remember. Watched The Social Dilemma, and probably like most people, I thought, yeah, it's probably about time to turn that off. Turn off the Facebook and just walk away. It's not good for us. But then I didn't turn it off. And then I kind of forgot about The Social Dilemma, and we moved on. And that was 4 months ago. Think about how disconnected you feel if you're not connected to social media. Well, this is a good instance of the radical isolation of the self. We feel like we're connected when we're connected virtually through the social networks that we're a part of. And if we disconnect from those social networks, whether or not those are real connections, that's up for debate. But then we become so radically isolated that we feel not just alone, but we feel alone to the extent that we cannot connect anymore. So I'm alone, and I don't have anyone with whom I can connect. Apart from text messaging, Facebook messaging, Instagramming, feeling connected through these media, it has become very difficult for me to feel connected with another human being in what we might call meat space or the real world. I'm not saying the virtual world isn't real, but we used to call the physical world the real world. Maybe you're still comfortable with doing that. I don't know. Morality also becomes radically fragmented. It becomes radically atomized. So that we're back to the kind of relativism and the kind of nihilism that we saw on the journey have become everyday features of common life. And the people that you meet each day like on the same trip or in the same group of people. I'll just pick an exercise class. In the same group of people, you might encounter an Epicurean, a nihilist, a relativist, a pantheist, a deist, and a Christian theist. They might all be in the same exercise class, or depending on the day of the week, they might change identities, right? And that radical fragmentation is an identity that you can take on depending on the need. And I think that the pressure of the times in which we live, not just postmodernism, but also COVID-19, have made this all a pretty profound question of survival. Does any of this have real value for survival? Will it help me survive? Okay, so we got to the fragmentation of the self. The question is, if I'm right about the self being this fragmented, I should say if Rick Roderick is right, because all these ideas are coming from him. But that was 30 years ago, so I'm trying to update it and bring it into the 21st century. If we're right about this diagnosis of what's wrong with the radical isolation of the self, the radical fragmentation of the self, you have no identity apart from what you are in these social networks, apart from what the media tells you, apart from like the brands that you wear or how you present yourself, like sexual identity, and that's radicalized, so that becomes who you are and how you define yourself. Has survivability value as well. Okay. If we're right about the fragmentation, the question is then, how do you put the self back together? How do you reconstruct some version of yourself? Or in other words, what is the value of this the whole tradition that we've been discussing? Is there any value to it, or do we all default now to nihilism, relativism, and Epicureanism? Do we want that to be our default setting? If you don't want that to be your default setting, if you still think, like if there's still some tiny little part of you that thinks there might be more, that there still is a best possible way to live, like however faint that glimmer of hope might be, right? Then maybe I could suggest that there are possibilities for retrieval. In other words, that you could still journey with Peter Kreeft and come to the end of the journey and say, well, given all of my options, this is the best one. Or as I look at the history and the development of Western philosophical thought, even though all of this is true, or in spite of the fact that all of this is true, right? I'm going to go back to like a notion such as virtue. I'm going to hold on to the fact that there are such things like wisdom and justice and courage and temperance and moderation. That there's such a thing as faith, hope, and love, and that those things come not from us as humans, but they come supernaturally from God's Holy Spirit, because that's something I learned from this story. It's not something that I learned from the Western philosophical tradition. It's something I have to learn from this story. As radical and insensitive and as like elitist as it might sound, you might come to the conclusion that no, I'm like, this is like double check mark. I believe this so fully that I'm going to take the consequences of everybody laughing at me, mocking me, rejecting me, isolating me, thinking I'm a conspiracy theorist or a crazy Christian, or that this story actually has the truth about what it means to be a human. And at some point you refuse to accept the postmodern critique. And you say, although all of that might be true as a cultural reality, I'm going to say no to that. I'm not going to buy into that. I'm going to live a different kind of way, right? And so you're going to pursue the philosophical tradition of virtue. You're going to pursue the philosophical tradition of like reasoned inquiry. You're going to ask critical questions and demand critical thinking of the people around you. So when it comes to questions, let's say, I'm just going to give you an example because I was like, you need a concrete example here. When it comes to questions of biological sex and gender, biological sex meaning the parts you're born with, gender meaning how you feel in relation to those parts, or how you feel socially as you express those parts in society, that biologically there are two sexes, with a small fraction of people who are born in an uncertain category, and doctors have to make a medical determination at the time of birth, call that intersexed people. And sometimes the doctors get that wrong, when we can be honest about that. But biologically speaking, there are two sexes. And that reasoned inquiry, in this philosophical tradition, would say, here is a physical reality. We have used our senses and we have used our reason to determine this is a fact or this is a reality. And that you will refuse to live by saying that there's more than one biological sex, or that someone could fully and finally completely change their biological sex. Not saying anything about compassion, not saying anything about people's struggles, the journey that they're on, their backgrounds, not saying anything about that. We're just talking about reasoned inquiry after facts. But that's part of this philosophical tradition. So reasoned inquiry and critical thinking. You might say that in addition to virtue and reasoned inquiry, right, there might be some question of final ends or goods. How do we determine what's ultimately good for people? We might, for example, determine that nihilism is not good for people, that it's not good for people to value nothing, that it's not good for people to say that all values are relative, or to say that nothing matters. That's not good for people, and that shouldn't be a view that's allowable. You might come to similar conclusions about Epicureanism, that it's not good to pursue any kind of pleasure, to whatever extent that looks like. So you might have some serious philosophical conversations around some of these values. Where do you go for the resources in those conversations? Well, you would still come back to biblical theism. You would still say, in the whole course of the history of ideas, I've looked at all of the menu options that are there available for me. And as bewildering as that is, and as overwhelming as all these terms are, I can look at all of that, assess it, and then say, you know what? Scripture, the story of the scriptures, still provides the best organizing principle, the best narrative, the best vision of what it means to be a human being. It gives me the best possible way to live. That doesn't mean that you have to be like suddenly you're a white supremacist. That doesn't mean that you're suddenly a bigot or a homophobic person. That doesn't mean that you have to be a raving capitalist, right-winger Republican. That doesn't mean that Christianity has to be identified with any kind of view on any political spectrum. It's just saying, as we assess this whole story, we can come back to the scriptures and find resources for human values. We can find resources and ideas that help give value to life and discover what makes life valuable. Things like what it means to be part of a family. Things like what it means to be the community of God. Things like what it means to have faith and hope and love. Those are all resources that we can get. So there are theological resources here. So if I could just draw my little data sign, there's theological resources, back here in the Greek philosophical tradition, there are resources. They don't have to all be suspect. You could also get more into, like, as we talked about, running out of space, but as we talked about morality, you could also have ethical resources. It's not that Kant's a totally bad guy or that the categorical imperative is necessarily bad. It just doesn't jive with the biblical theism. Like, it's religion or morality within the limits of reason alone. It's an Enlightenment ethic. And so because it's not rooted in the scriptures, it's going to be fundamentally flawed. And you can interact with that, but you can also critique it. You could say that there are, like, you might reject Kantianism, or you might reject utilitarianism. You could take an ethics class with me in the fall. We could talk about it more, right? You could also look to this Christian tradition and the Hebrew wisdom tradition as it feeds into Christianity, and note that there are certain spiritual practices and disciplines that might inform what this new way of living in the 21st century looks like. In other words, if we let things get a bit out of control with modernity, for the last 500 years, let's just say things have been getting a little bit out of control, it might be good to dial that back to what happened before, what was going on before 1500 in the Protestant Reformation. Well, there was a whole monastic tradition that, in the face of an overwhelming cultural change, withdrew from the culture and focused on scripture and spiritual practices. Now, you might not want to go join a Benedictine monastery and wake up at 4 a.m. to say your prayers and stay up until 1 a.m. to say the other prayers. You might not want to do that. But in that whole tradition, going all the way back to David, and you could look at the life of Jesus himself, there are spiritual practices that you could appeal to inform a life that is more in alignment with the story of the Bible and life as it's meant to be lived, or as the God of the Bible would frame the best possible way to live. And again, you don't have to be authoritarian to do that. You don't have to say it's only this way. It's to make a compelling kind of argument that there is such a thing as the best possible way to live, and it's found here, and there are resources to get after what that might look like in the Bible itself, in the philosophical tradition, in some of the moral debates in the philosophical tradition, and in the spiritual practices of Christianity down through the centuries. That there are resources for what this life could look like, that there's hope for that, and structure, and in the face of all of this radical postmodern critique, that you could find something to hold on to that actually gives you survival value. When faced with a crisis like COVID-19, you could actually thrive. You might not actually become a person who's overwhelmed at all. You might not be a person who withdraws into their house and doesn't come out for a year. You might be equipped with the resources because of philosophy and because of the values and because of the story of the scriptures, the best possible way to live. You might actually become a person who can get out and do new, creative, innovative, brave, courageous, amazing things, even in the midst of a worldwide pandemic. Right? That the story of the scriptures could actually equip you for not just surviving, but living life as it's meant to be, even during COVID-19. That would be really exciting. That would be cool. Do you remember when we took, this is the last thing I'm going to talk about. Do you remember when we took those 2 weeks and we talked about Thomas Aquinas with the psychology class next door? And this is right in the Thomas Aquinas part, so I felt comfortable erasing him. He's not offended. He's probably jumping up and down on his cloud somewhere in heaven right now, excited for this next part. We talked about a model of the human being in Thomas Aquinas that's holistic and tiered and involves plasticity. I hesitate to use the word plastic because the documentaries say the oceans are full of it and it's bad to have plastic now. So I'm not like, I understand that there's negative connotations around plastic, but face it, you love plastic. You're probably wearing it on your body somewhere. We use plastics. So plastic is a good thing. The technical term here is plasticity, but that is not a word that you meet each day. So we know that we need to be malleable, that we need to have a human psyche that can change, right? It can grow. It can be traumatized. It can regress. It can move from point A to point B, right? It can mature. It can age. So we have a holistic view of the human person where our bodies and our minds and our spirits are all tied together in one holistic view of the person. We have a tiered spirituality where our will can make decisions that can override our emotions. Sometimes our emotions take over, but we can have a rationality that overrides our will. We can have will that overrides our rationality. We have a tiered psychology that can allow us to make good decisions as a human, even when they're difficult or painful decisions. And we can grow and we can change. And we do grow and we change based on the inputs and the decisions that we make, right? If you want to not just survive COVID-19, if you want to have the best possible way to live, even in the midst of a global pandemic, if you want to try to take a crack at this, then I'm guessing that you want a kind of moral psychology, a view of your own self that fits this Thomas Aquinas neuroscience pattern. You want to be a whole person. Like, you want to be happy. Like, you want to be happy in your body. You want to be happy in your thoughts and in your mind and your thinking. You want to be happy in your emotions. And you want all of those to be balanced in a way that you're like, yeah, it's a good day. I'm glad that I have today. You're thriving, you're well, you're hale, you're happy, you're healthful. I think that's part of the best possible way to live. If Christianity doesn't give you that, then, like, I'm out. It's got to have that ability to give us a healthy, whole, well-integrated life. If postmodernity is fragmenting our lives and breaking us apart so we don't even feel human anymore, Christianity has got to restore this. Otherwise, it's of no value. It doesn't have survivability value. It's not going to give me any motivation to adopt it or do any of these practices. Okay. So last night in our board meeting, church board meeting, brought in a lady in our church who, she's a colleague of Dr. Shaw. She teaches at Spring Arbor. She's got a master's degree in social work. She's a clinical social worker, does supervisions for people doing licensed master of social work and counseling programs. And I brought her in to educate our church leadership just on mental health generally. What types of mental health issues do people struggle with out there? What can we expect as church leaders? And she gave us a really good overview of mental health. And one of the things she said was really striking to me. She said at the end of her conversation, most of the time, if you have a good counselor and you go to see a good counselor, that counselor is going to ask you some questions that might lead to you not even needing counseling therapy or psychotherapy. A good counselor is going to say, like, are you taking a vitamin D supplement? Are you getting enough sunlight? Because in Michigan in the winter, there's 6 months where we don't see the sun. Or you're indoors all the time and you're never getting any vitamin D. How is your sleep? Are you sleeping 7 to 8 hours a night? How is your nutrition? What are you eating in a given day? Do you eat a lot and then nothing? Do you eat nothing a lot of the time? What does the quality of your food look like? How about exercise? Do you even go outside and walk for 30 minutes or an hour a day? What are your spiritual practices? Do you have any spiritual practices? Do you pray or meditate or do yoga? Do you have any kind of embodied, any kind of movement practice? And so as you check those boxes, she said, because we're talking about a holistic life that is tiered and involves plasticity, the ability to grow and change, if you don't have those boxes checked, those 6 or 7 boxes checked, let's not talk counseling therapy. I'm not going to counsel you until you go get 8 hours of sleep. Give me 8 hours of sleep for a week. Let's see if you still need counseling. because we're a holistic people. We need to tend to our bodies. We need to tend to our physical needs as human beings. And then we can begin to get involved in questions of emotional health, mental health, spiritual health, growth and practice. And we'd say in Christianity, we'd say sanctification or growth in likeness to Christ. Then we can talk about those things, but we've got to get you physically healthy first. So as I was thinking about this, I was really gratified in myself because I have two teenagers now. I have a 14-year-old daughter and I have a 12-year-old son, and he is totally a teenager. He's 12, but he is going through it, man. And he can be as difficult as a middle school boy can be, but also with the emotions and the tears come. But what I'm really happy about is in the midst of all of that, in the midst of COVID-19, in the midst of having a dying grandmother in the house with us, going through her dying process last September, being schooled at home, doing virtual for 6 months, going through everything that we did in 2020, these kids are healthy and they're thriving. And you can go down the list of the things that the psychologists listed, and yes, they actually take their vitamin D supplement every day. We make sure they go to bed on time. We limit screens and blue light influence. There's no phones, no social media. They're exercising every day. They're getting outside. They're having sunshine. They're eating good food. All as part of a holistic life, that if we have those boxes checked, then I can go to a person and say, yeah, and there's more. There's a larger story that you can be a part of. There is such a thing as the best possible way to live. And it doesn't sound disingenuous or hollow because they're healthy, whole people. We've got to get people to the point where they're healthy and whole and not so fragmented. If we could move in that direction, then we get them on the path of the journey and say, okay, there's more. Let's get you this direction. And if people are already Christian, then we also have to address these things, because unless you have that holistic health, the values and the practices of Christianity aren't going to make sense, and they're not going to address those issues all by themselves. It's like someone's, they can't swim and they're drowning in COVID-19, and you hand them like a 3-course dinner. We need to get them not drowning. We need to get them to survival. And once they're able to survive, once we get them healthy and holistically well, then we can start moving in the direction of there's more. Right? We can address that immediate need first. Okay, so that's what I have. I want to try to maintain in the midst of postmodern struggle, in the midst of COVID-19, you can survive and you can find the best possible way to live and excel in that and live into that. Like God in you can do immeasurably more than you ask or imagine. And that can be a joyful experience of a human life and not just barely scratching by, surviving. Who knows when we're going to come out of the cave of COVID-19. So I hope that that's an encouragement to you.